So, this past January, I went on a class trip to visit Christian and Buddhist monasteries in Western Massachusetts. I was deeply inspired by the monks we met, both Buddhist and Christian. They moved with such intention, with such love, and with such grace. It's like every moment, no matter how small, was significant. Moments that I typically take for granted. And I found myself loving the silence, the prayers, the meditations, the readings. On one particular afternoon, I decided to make tea. I was feeling so excited to the point that I stopped paying close attention to what I was doing. And instead of boiling the tea kettle, I had started boiling my professor's pot of rice. A solid 5 minutes passed before I even noticed. And when I did, I panicked. I turned off the burner and moved the rice to cool off and proceeded to boil the kettle like nothing happened. When we sat down for dinner, my professor apologized and said, "I don't know how the rice got so mushy. I'm so sorry." And I said absolutely nothing. I just sat there. Not my proudest moment, but I'm telling you, it is God's grace that rice was just mushy and not completely burnt. At our stay at St. Abbey's, Father Messenger met with us, one of the monks, and he taught us the basics of contemplative prayer. He told us that if we fall asleep in prayer, that's okay, because we're actually falling asleep in God's arms. And when we wake, we can return to prayer. And when we do, we are just reaffirming our love for God. Father Messenger was also one of the most hilarious monks I've ever met. He shared quite a few entertaining stories, one of which I would love to share with you all. Father Messenger once led centering prayer for an auditorium full of businessmen, probably about 100 of them. And without even realizing it, as he's leading them in prayer, he dozed off. It turns out he slept and snored into the microphone for a solid 15 minutes. And he shared this to reassure us that it is okay if you do fall asleep when you pray. Father Messenger also shared his understanding of grace with us. He quoted a nun he had crossed paths with many years back. The way that she talked about grace fundamentally transformed him. That nun told him, God's grace is in everything. In everything. This realization changed me too, because I tend to think of God's graces in the little miracles we experience, but not necessarily in my own pain and suffering. But the truth is, God's grace is in all of it. In the pain, in the anger, in the sadness, in the midst of our struggles, but also in the moments that bring us pure joy. Grace ripples through our bodies, through the love that we share, the heartaches we endure. Even when it may feel like God is not there, God is always there, in the noise and in the silence. As I wrote this sermon, I tried to capture the essence of grace, what it looks like, what it could feel like, but I fell short, and I still fall short. And I think that's what's happening in John's passage today. I first want to acknowledge that there are many ways to interpret and understand this passage. What I'm about to talk about is certainly not the only way. It is purely a window into my own struggles with the text. When reading the scripture, I am stuck at, "The works that I do in my Abba's name testify to me, but you do not believe because you do not belong to my sheep." You do not belong to my sheep. Who is the you? We know that when reading the passage, John's Jesus crossed paths with this Greek word that starts with an I, and I'm just not even going to bother trying. In most biblical scriptures, this Greek word is translated to mean the Jews. Many scholars argue against the inaccuracy of this translation, believing the word to be more closely aligned to the Judeans. More specifically, Judean refers to a person regardless of their actual geographical location, but as one who is loyal to the ways of Judea, a major economic center of Palestine during the time of Jesus. Therefore, this translation is not one that reflects a religious difference, but one based on ideological or political loyalties. It is also incredibly important to note that this passage has also been used throughout history to promote harm, with little consideration of what the Jews means in this text. And I do not carry that lightly. And this is also not new to us. As queer and trans Christians, we know how Scripture has been used for hatred rather than for love. But even when knowing the complications that reside behind these translations, why would John's Jesus tell anyone that they are not a part of his sheep? When contextualizing the Scripture further, we are reminded that this passage situates us, the reader, in a very specific time of year, the Feast of Dedication, or what we now know as Hanukkah. The feast commemorates the victory of the Maccabees over the Assyrian forces. After the victory, Jewish communities refurbished the temple because it had been profaned by sacrifices of unclean animals. If the reader keeps in mind the history of the feast, the Judeans' hostility towards Jesus is understandable, considering the Greek king who led the Syrian forces was guilty of blasphemy for thinking himself to be equal to God. When I hold this pain and confusion, I see potential for othering in the text, but also a potential for comfort, healing, and grace. John's Jesus does say, "You do not belong to my sheep," but he also says, "No one will snatch the sheep out of my hand." While I am thrown off by the division created, I am also comforted knowing that I will never be snatched out of God's hand. I am reminded that nothing I or any of us do or say will separate us from the love of God. Reverend Boone, an MCC minister in New York, preached this year's Good Friday service. He reminded our congregation there in New York that we as people project what we understand about love and about grace onto God. In reality, God's love and grace is too encompassing for us to even fully imagine. And I think that is what's happening in John's scripture. There is this glimpse of misunderstanding, a natural inability to fully conceptualize God's love, perhaps fueled by a place of pain during the time the gospel was written, followed by a profound statement: we will never be snatched from God's hands, from God's grace. Grace in our scripture today reminds us that we can hold two seemingly contradictory views together, what my friend calls a dialectic in psychiatry. We can acknowledge the challenges in the text, if you've experienced a similar reaction as I did, and the divine grace that unfolds. The dialectic reminds me of one of my favorite children's books called The Firebird. In the story, there's a young little bird that turns to his mom and asks, "Why, Mom? Why does God let the storm take the sun away?" Then one stormy day, when Firebird was old enough, his mother told him he will find his answer above the clouds. So he weathered the storm and flew high above the rain. As Firebird soared above the clouds, all alone, in the midst of the darkest room, he saw the sun shining more brightly than ever. And then he knew God never let the storm take the sun away. It was as constant as his mother's love, waiting there, just above the clouds. Even on the cloudiest day, when it is storming and raining and miserable, the sun is still shining above the clouds. The goal for us is to try to remember that. God's grace is always with us, even when we do not see it. We just have to take a walk on the clouds. Firebird calls us to think about God's love like the sun. It is constant and unchanging. What if one day we really realize that nothing could take that away? Nothing could take us away from God's grace. From my viewpoint, I can see othering created in our passage today, othering that I'm sure we all in this room have faced more than once in our lives, whether because of our sexuality, our socioeconomic status, our gender expression, our gender identity, the color of our skin, our culture. But the experience of othering also brought together MCC. It brought us together in community, and no one can snatch that away from us. It is the message from John that inspired me to include the Gospel of Mary Magdalene today, because like many of us, she experienced othering in her community, but she never experienced othering from God. The passage I chose is a moment after Jesus died and the disciples feared for their lives and questioned how they'd be able to share the good news to the world. Mary responds with immense compassion and love. Do not weep and be distressed, nor let your hearts be weary. For Jesus' grace will be with you all and will shelter you. Rather, we should praise their greatness, for they have prepared us and made us human beings. Made us human beings. I love that. It makes our minds and our hearts and our bodies themselves sacred. Mary also reminds us that Jesus' grace, God's grace, will always be with us. Their grace will shelter us through our darkest, loneliest storms, even when it may feel like they're not even there. And as the poet Gret Swan so eloquently says in her poem, God doesn't hear me, God responds. Remember my love, remember I care. I hear every cry, and I hear every prayer. My answer is coming through, not always clear. But trust me, my child, for I'll always be near. Because God's grace is, in fact, in everything. Everything. Amen.